Okay, so this is module number 3 for our all-office-wide training program. And this one is going to be focusing on something we haven't focused on explicitly in our training programs before, and that's risk. And the reason that we're doing that is because risk is such a fundamental part of what we do, and because on July 1st, when we reorganize the office, everybody in the office is going to be starting to deal with the full spectrum of risk in a way that you may or may not have done before, but most of you haven't. So instead of being on a minimal risk team that maybe focuses on maybe this much of the risk, or on full board, focuses on this much of the risk, you're going to be potentially dealing with applications that cover the full spectrum of risk. So it makes it really important for us to talk about what is risk and how do we assess it. Risk is probably the most fundamental concept in the human subjects regulations. I actually Googled it and looked for how many times it was mentioned in the Common Rule. 52 times. And perhaps the best known regulation of all that pretty much everybody can quote is something about the risks being reasonable in relation to the benefit. So risk is one of the most fundamental parts of what we deal with, and of course it comes out of one of the 3 Belmont principles, the principle of beneficence. So one of the things that we're doing for the training is that we have chapter 3 of our core education handbook. It's a little bit longer than some of the others, in part because we don't have any other SOPs or checklists or guidance or worksheets about risk, and so everything is in here along with some suggested activities for focusing on risk. So here's the big one, as I said, 45 CFR 46111A2. Risks to subjects are reasonable in relation to anticipated benefits. This is one of the most important criteria for IRB approval. So the goal of this today and of all the activities around risk that we're going to be doing this week are to sort of review some basic knowledge, which most of you are probably pretty familiar with already, but most of all to focus on the process of how we assess risk in studies and where it plays a role in the various determinations and things that we do. The idea is that we want to all have a shared, consistent framework for how we go about doing this, and to perhaps at the end of this week to have a risk assessment guide sheet that we can add to our toolkit of how we assess risk. And you might not use the guide sheet all the time, but at the very least it's something that we envision being helpful for new people in the office. In our sessions on Thursday and on Monday, there are 2 case studies that we'll be focusing on, and I'm asking that you use this draft guide sheet on risk assessment as you look at those 2 case studies. There's 4 questions laid out on the guide sheet that have to do with assessing risk. Now, you don't have to fill it out. You can, if you want, you can use it for notes. You don't have to write anything. Just come prepared to discuss those case studies. So first of all, what is risk? Risk refers to the probability and the magnitude of some future harm. It's that simple. It's simple. So here's one illustration. Lifelong smokers have a 1 in 2 chance of dying from smoking-related disease. It'll never happen to me. The odds of winning the Powerball lottery are 80 million to 1. This could be my lucky day. So this cartoon is a great illustration of some of the challenges associated with assessing risk, namely that we aren't very good at it. And that's going to be one of the main themes here, is that humans are notoriously bad at estimating or understanding probabilities. And I'm going to spend quite a bit of time on that today, because we have to estimate probabilities of risk all the time, and so do our IRB members. It's a fundamental part of what we do. So it's very important that we be aware of the fact that humans are known to be bad at doing this, that we have certain kinds of tendencies that throw off our assessments of probabilities. because the more we're aware of that tendency, the more we can guard against it and make our estimates more accurate. So be self-aware of this problem, and of course, seek expertise. There's lots of ways we can do this in the office. We can go to consultants, other IRB members, other people in the office, and so on. So what are some of the ways in which we get this wrong, the odds wrong? I mean, when you're talking about things like a roulette wheel or throwing the dice, it's pretty easy to know exactly what the probability of an outcome is. It can be mathematically calculated. It's pretty hard and fast. It's not so true when it comes to the kinds of risks that we assess in the work that we look at. And one of the problems is, as some people summarize it, we fear snakes, not cars. And what that's intended to convey is that there are sometimes emotional components to understanding risks. So, it might make sense to be afraid of heights in this kind of situation when there's absolutely no safety netting and no real safety whatsoever in this situation. But here's the famous skywalk. I think it's on the south side of the Grand Canyon that goes out over the Grand Canyon, and it's a glass ceiling, so you're looking way down, like a mile down to the Grand Canyon. Well, here, the probability that something bad is going to happen to you here is really low because it's very safe, but we still get that thrill of fear suggesting that we think there is a risk here, when in fact the risk is really low. And this is something that's very emotional, sort of inherent in humans, to be afraid of heights. So a second thing that is known and well discovered by cognitive psychologists about how we assess risk is that we tend to overestimate the odds of dreadful but infrequent events, whether it's being hit by space trash falling out of the sky, or trampled by a marauding elephant, or bitten by a white shark. We tend to fear those spectacular, unlikely events. A third thing is that we have difficulty understanding how small risks add up over time. So in other words, we tend to be really fearful of cancer and not so fearful of heart disease. And you might say, well, cancer is a horrible disease, it's painful, all sorts of bad things happen. But if you've ever had a family member who's had serious heart disease and died from it, you know it's just as bad with heart disease. And so doing things like eating an ice cream cone every day, it's going to add up inside your arteries, but it sure doesn't seem very risky when you're eating that ice cream cone, does it? The fourth thing is that when we feel like we have control over an outcome, or if we choose to take the risk voluntarily, it often seems less risky. So some people like to talk about this as, I don't want any pesticide in my backyard unless I put it there. And then, of course, the risk is more acceptable. Sort of a related concept is, again, that we feel like we have a false sense of safety when we have some control, or we perceive that we have more control over a risky situation. So it's been shown that although seat belts are known to save lives, that wearing seat belts is also associated with often driving faster than people who don't habitually wear seat belts. And it's also been shown that people who drive really big SUVs are more likely to drive in somewhat riskier manners in some situations like snow and ice on the road. Maybe it's not justified. Another aspect of risk that we're swayed by is the values issue. In other words, risk decisions are not always about the risks alone. There are emotions and there are values that can play into it. So in our culture, drinking alcohol is legal, widely accepted. There's sort of a positive or at least a neutral value about it in most people's minds. But smoking marijuana is illegal in many places and doesn't have the same positive value associated with it for most of the population the way that alcohol does. And that shows up in how people tend to rate the risks of drinking alcohol versus smoking marijuana. Those assessments of risks are not borne out by the scientific evidence. We tend to find it easier to accept, quote, natural risks than risks that come from technology or that we impose on ourselves. The classic example of this is that people often will spend a lot of time in the sun without sunscreen, like I did yesterday, not thinking anything at all of it, but are really very afraid and concerned about nuclear reactors and the risk of them, when in fact the risk to an individual may be a lot stronger and more harmful from repeated sun exposure than living near a nuclear reactor. So research risk assessment is subject to all of these same biases. These biases have been shown again and again and again for decades by cognitive psychologists, economists, political scientists, a whole host of people doing research on them. So, as I said, it's important that we be aware of our tendency to have our risk assessments biased by these kinds of things. So let's talk about an example. One of the kinds of risks that we deal with all the time is the risk of a breach of confidential data. And I'm not saying we shouldn't be concerned about it. That's not where I'm going. But it's important to think about that risk and how much of it we experience in everyday life. To remember, the definition of minimal risk has to do with exposure to risks that one ordinarily encounters in everyday life. So, how many people used a credit card or a debit card in the last 48 hours? Yeah, I didn't see any hand that didn't go up. And how many of you heard about any of these breaches that occurred last year? So this represents millions and millions and millions of credit card names and numbers and addresses and phone numbers that were breached from these companies just last year. And these are, of course, only the big ones that got into the news. There were lots more. So I think it's safe to say that nowadays that everyday life does include the risk of some kind of breach of confidential, private, identifiable information that can hurt us in some way or another. So it's important to think about that when we're talking about risks in a research study too. Now I'm not saying necessarily that makes all of these kinds of situations minimal risk. But we do need to think about the fact that our culture has changed over time and that some confidentiality risks that 20 years ago would have been very serious and unusual are now everyday occurrences for us. So I'm almost done, actually, and then I can take some questions. I want to address one other issue that we won't have a lot of time to talk about in the sessions this week. But it's something that comes up, and we haven't talked about it for a while. That is, how does our office fit in to the whole concept of risk management at the University of Washington? There's an office of risk management. There's actually two offices. There's one for all of campus, this one that actually operates out of what's called finance and facilities. And then there's an office of health sciences risk management that covers things like the medical school. So how do we fit in? We're not part of the Office of Risk Management. So what do we do? I know that sometimes when people are reviewing things, they think about the fact that this could be risky to the university. This could get us sued, or this could get us in the newspaper. Is that something that we're supposed to be spending our time on? Well, no, in a nutshell. We contribute to risk management at the University of Washington by just doing our job, by following the Belmont principles and complying with the human subjects regulations. We are not explicitly charged either by the regs or by the university with considering the risks to the university about things like getting sued or showing up in the media. When you come across something like that, it's great to bring it to the attention of me or somebody in the management team, and we may want to go bring that to somebody's attention. But it's not the kind of thing that we should take into account when we're deciding whether or not to approve something. It shouldn't be a part of a minimal risk decision, whether or not something is minimal risk, and it shouldn't be a part of the IRB deciding whether or not the risks are reasonable in relation to the anticipated benefits. So this university is, as I've said before, very entrepreneurial. And part of what that means is risk, because being an entrepreneur brings with it risks. And this university has deliberately decided to adopt a risk management strategy overall for everything, instead of risk avoidance. And that carries through to the research mission. So our job is to protect the subjects by following the Belmont principles and the regulations, and leave the rest of it up to the lawyers and everybody else at the university. They will take care of the media thing, except once in a while I get dragged in, and that sort of thing. And so we don't need to take that into account and worry about it while we're making our IRB decisions. Yeah, whoops. That was all I had. Sorry, did I just...
Did you want to record the Q&A?
Yeah, I'll do that. So, does anybody have any questions? Elizabeth.
It's really interesting, the citation of all the social science research, and I really appreciate that. So knowing the human tendency to over or under-assess risk or misassess it, do you have suggestions for the IRBs for individual reviewers and how to bear this kind of bias?
Right. Do I have suggestions for individual reviewers and how to bear this in mind? Well, one of the things that the risk assessment guide is designed to do is to help us with that by possibly making sure that we consider all of the risks, that we identify all of the risks in a study, including ones that may be really familiar to us. And then that we have a mechanism for assessing the probability and the magnitude, the source of the risk, and so on. And it also points out the importance and the value of getting some expertise if you don't have any. Now, you don't always need to do that. You don't always need to know exactly what the risk of some kind of breach is if you know that it's going to be fairly minimal. But when the risk is higher, and we don't have, when the magnitude is higher, and we don't have much information about the probability, it would make a lot of sense to go seek the advice of a consultant in that area or an IRB member. The hard part for us and for our IRB members is that by the very definition of the fact that we're looking at research, there just isn't good information lots of times about the probability of risk. And yet we're being asked to make that assessment. That's the challenge. And so I want to try to create a sort of consistent framework and process for how we do that. Other questions or comments? Yeah, Chanel?
I guess I'm wondering what you think about the idea that I'm thinking about research where subjects will donate a sample of something that they're having a procedure done clinically, and so they want to take some kind of extra sample. And I've kind of heard some people, kind of say a little bit of an attitude of like, well, if you've gone in for a procedure, someone's probably taken stuff from you and kept it anyway, so what's the big deal about, it happening in research? So kind of just like, what's the big deal? It happens all the time in a clinical setting. And to my mind, I'm really uncomfortable with that kind of thinking of like, well, it happens all the time in a clinical setting, so, what's the big deal that happens in research? And I guess I'm just wondering what you think about how we should think about that issue in terms of this. Does that make sense?
Well, I think so. I think part of what you're getting at is the fact that sometimes there's a non-research procedure associated with the research procedure. one of the most important parts of the risk assessment that we do is, first of all, figuring out what are the sources of the research risk in a proposed activity. If we don't do that properly, our risk assessment is going to be all off. And so that's what the whole support study, the pediatric oxygen study, is all about at the heart of it. It is what were the research risks in that study and what was just ordinary clinical care. And the scenario that you just described of taking an extra little bit of a specimen during a clinical procedure is another good example. What is the research procedure and what is being done for clinical reasons separately? Now, it's true that people take extra specimens for clinical reasons all the time. In fact, they're required to. It's part of the CLIA law that whenever you take a little bit, especially of tissue, you have to take enough that some can be retained indefinitely in the pathology and the laboratory archives for quality control or to go back for another reason. So they always take a little extra. That's true. And here we are as a researcher coming in and taking a little bit extra more. Well, does that mean there's no real extra risk for that? Not necessarily. The extra that's being taken for clinical reasons is being stored in a certain kind of way and will be used in a certain kind of way under certain circumstances. The extra bit being taken for research purposes is going to be used for different purposes, most likely, and therefore would have different risks associated with it. Does that help? Another example that I like to use, I know I've told you all of this before, has to do with the study that we reviewed back in the 2000s, Tim DeRuin's study of looking at mercury amalgam fillings versus non-amalgam fillings. All sorts of interesting things around that study. For a variety of reasons, it got international attention from a number of groups. And among other things that happened, there was a complaint lodged with LHRP alleging that we had not required the researchers to adequately describe the research risks in the consent form because they didn't describe the risks of the amalgam, mercury amalgam, versus the non-amalgam. We and the researchers at the time believed that the risks of the fillings were not really part of the research. But in fact, we, the researchers, were determining which type of filling the kids got. And that meant that that was a research procedure. And we should have described the risks of the two kinds of fillings. So that's another example where distinguishing between what's research and what's not is really, really critical.
And also kind of thinking about the surgical one, there are also times when you have a clinical risk, like you'll be under general anesthesia to get your surgery. That's not something to do with research. But if we're taking an extra sample, it might extend your surgery time for X amount. Let's say it's a really complicated sample to get to, let's say it's 10, 20 minutes or something like that. So being under general anesthesia in and of itself isn't a research risk, but the fact that we're doing some research stuff and sort of that extra 20 minutes becomes a research risk. So we have to explain to them that, yeah, you're going to be under general anesthesia. It's going to be longer if you do this and act onto these other types of risks. So in some cases, it's not like a clear split between these are research and these are clinical, but if you go into research, your clinical risks are going to be extended or augmented or whatever the case might be.
Exactly. Sherry?
I guess when I, as a non-review person, when I think about research risks, they're always very tied in my mind to risks versus benefits. So how are we going to try and tear those two apart a little bit, or just is this just kind of the first step to going down this path?
That's a great question. Are we going to be doing the same? I'm rewording your question.
Yeah, sure.
Are we going to do the same kind of thing for the whole benefits piece? And to carry that on, we should also be doing it for how we compare risk and benefits. We aren't in this particular training program because we're focusing on some real basics. And I believe that we have the most difficulty assessing risks. It's not that benefits are necessarily any easier, but they're usually summed up by saying the benefit of the knowledge to society. There isn't very often benefit to individual subjects, whereas risk can be anything: physical, legal, social, economic, psychological, big, small, horrible, not much. So it's really difficult to assess risks compared to benefits. Leah?
Something I always find when you're doing genetic information. And something that often comes up is there's been a lot of advances in genetic capabilities recently, and will continue to be in the future. And so when you're storing this specimen in a repository and are allowing future genetic research on it, it's really hard to assess what the risk is. You don't know what the best sample. How do you proceed?
That is a really good question. Could you hear it on this side? It's how do you assess future risks that you think are coming, but you don't really know what they are yet? And genetics is a great example. So OHRP, when they've been asked this question, likes to just keep saying the same thing over and over again, which is you're only supposed to consider the risks you know about. I don't find that personally very satisfying, and I don't think that's sufficient. I think that we have an obligation under the Belmont principles to go just a little bit beyond that without overdoing it. And if it looks like there's a trajectory of some kind where a certain kind of risk you can see is going to become more and more likely or more easily manifested over time, then I think we have an obligation to consider that. Genetics is a perfect example. Clearly, in the last 10 years, it has become much more possible to do genetic analyses on a really large number of samples really fast, to look at a number of different things we could never look at before. And we also know that it's a lot easier for breaches of information to occur. So if you add all of those things together, I think that we have to conclude there are risks that we cannot anticipate for genetic information that we should be taking at least to some degree into account. But I think that those are probably context dependent. You know, what is the population that the specimens are being taken from and that sort of thing. That's an opinion. That is not a regulatory analysis. Mm-hmm.
So if a data breach is something that we can sort of say is kind of a part of ordinary life, does that mean a lot of the studies, a lot of the behavioral studies are going to be bumped down to expediting?
Well, you know, I think a lot of behavioral studies already have been bumped down to expedited, not necessarily because of the confidentiality issue. There's a whole host of reasons for that. One of the most important things about that example that I gave is that, yes, a breach of confidentiality is a part of everyday life now, but we still need to think about what is the information that's being breached and how is it going to hurt people when it happens. In the chapter, there is, in the section about magnitude of the risk, there's an important set of bullet points about this to consider when you're thinking about the severity of harm, just the general experience, the burden of efforts to reduce the harm, the efforts on the ability to perform activities of daily life or to pursue your life goals, how long the harm lasts, the extent to which you can adapt to the new circumstances after the breach, and the burden of doing that. So if you think about those kinds of things in terms of having a breach of credit card information on Target and you know you shopped at Target during that period, versus some of the other kinds of information, that's where they may not come out as both being minimal risk. It just all depends. Yeah.
So going further with this, I mean, I'm sure that the breaches of confidentiality, for example, at WFC and whatnot, people are trolling around, you know, for
So one of the other things that's brought out in the chapter is that when we're assessing risk and benefits, what we're supposed to do is we're supposed to assess the mitigated risks. In other words, the risks as they exist after the researchers have put into place all the controls that they're going to do or that we're going to require them to do. So it's not just about the risk of a breach. It's about the risk of a breach under the conditions in which the research data are being stored and protected. So the data at UW Medicine, for example, are under extraordinarily deep and serious firewalls and all sorts of other protections. That's because of the nature of the information and the consequences of those breaches. That may or may not be necessary for some kinds of research data, but we're supposed to consider those protections in deciding what the overall risk is. Other questions, comments?
Well, I just wanted to comment that in response to Evelyn's question, that the determination that a study is no more than minimal risk, given the protections put in place by the researcher in response to review, still don't necessarily mean that the study be transferred. So those are really separate decisions, transferred from full committee to minimal risk.
Yeah, the decision about whether or not a study is minimal risk is certainly an important factor in deciding whether it's reviewed by the full convened committee or expedited review. And we all know it has to be minimal risk in order to be expedited. But there are some studies where even if they meet the definition of minimal risk, we may still want them to be reviewed by a full committee for reasons that don't have to do with the risk and maybe have to do with something else, like the nature of the study population being very vulnerable.
And very often, full IRB review would be necessary in order to determine that risks have been mitigated or reduced to no more than minimum.
That's true, and that is a tried and true way for doing it, but we're hoping that in the coming year, as we establish a more formal consultant service for all of you to draw on, that there will be times when you'll be able to go and get some 1 or 2 or 3 consultants' opinion about the risk, so that it would make you comfortable deciding after getting opinions that it was minimal risk and didn't need to go to the full committee to make that decision. Other questions or comments?
At the beginning, we showed that risk spectrum where minimal risk sees one thing and full board sees another, and then there's maybe a sort of gray area in the middle. And I was wondering if you can point to any examples where you may have seen sort of misunderstanding between the two groups. So, for example, maybe examples of where the full board might have seen things that they thought were really risky, but actually minimal risk deals with them all the time.
Probably others in this room are better able to come up with the examples than me, because I don't sit in on very many meetings. So the only ones I hear about are the ones where there was a problem with non-compliance. Probably not good examples.
The opposite. Sometimes Committee G has seen things that have been where the expedited review team has asked the full IRB to review it, and we don't really perceive any risks more than minimal, but nonetheless.
And that's one of the issues I'm hoping that we'll be able to talk a lot about in our session, and that I hope the case scenarios will sort of stimulate that discussion. It's like, what do you do if you're doing what you think might be an expedited review, but you're really not comfortable making that decision about whether it's minimal risk or not, because you don't have the information, you don't feel like you know enough, or you have the expertise. Right now, as we said, our standard approach to that situation is to bump it up to full committee. But I'd like to expand the possibilities that we have for how to deal with those situations, so that it doesn't always have to go to full committee and take up time on an agenda. Some of you have heard those of us on the management team talking about Jeff Cooper occasionally. He started out as one of the, he was actually an IRB chair in New York for many years, and then he was the assistant director of AHARP for many years, did a lot of site visits, and then he moved to WERB. I don't even remember where he is, Huron, and then WERB. Anyway, he's a really well-known IRB consultant and maven who has very interesting ideas. His most recent blog posting was about the flexibility of doing expedited review and about exactly this issue, that instead of bumping something up to full committee, it might actually be more ethical and a better use of a better risk assessment to pull in a consultant or two, maybe even the consultant's an IRB member. But instead of taking up time on a meeting agenda and going to 9 people who look at something and say, we didn't need to look at this, and so they kind of dismiss it, don't review it very carefully, maybe it's better to pull in a couple of consultants who will really look at just that one item and give you a good assessment of the risk that you can then rely on.
Sort of a question like, well, along those lines is, when you get off the freeway, sometimes you're speeding on the way home because you're velocitized from having gone so fast for so long. I wonder if the full board is reviewing nothing but to be velocitized.
Oh, velocitized, okay.
She's talking in driver's ed. So my question would be, do we ever find that full board is reviewing, studies where someone might die or might get horribly injured or there's an experimental drug and all these things? If something gets bumped up for minimal risk, let's say it's a medical records review with a lot of really dicey information, and let's say the minimal risk person says, this is too much for me to do by myself. Do we ever find that the board is, we're more concerned that people are going to die, this is sort of meh, when in reality there are risks there, but the board's been velocitized by going so fast with such high physical risks or things like that for so long that they don't pay proper duty?
There is one person in our office who has told me that that one particular board does appear to have habituated to the biomedical risks and tends to downplay the other kinds of risks. I don't know if that's really true. I have no idea. But it wouldn't be surprised. It's human nature. I mean, this thing about assessing the probabilities of risk, we underestimate the probabilities of things that are not so big and scary and that we think we have some control over. So,
I don't know about right now, but Richard will remember back in the 90s when Committee C, we would do dual review with biomedical committees, and very often the application as submitted these would be biomedical. The application as submitted would say there are no risks because there are no physical procedures. So that's kind of what you're talking about.
Yes.
It's been a long time since we've seen that.
that was in some of the minutes back then, too.
Yes.
Which is kind of scary.
Yes.
Emily?
Well, I just want to comment in general too. I never heard that word. I think it's awesome. I think in some ways, sometimes communities have the opposite problem. So, they're used to seeing research that's just slightly a little bit more than minimal risk. And they get very used to that, very used to that. And then sometimes you can feel like risk comes along. They're very used to seeing something that's not their risk, and they don't look as terrible. So what do you think the opposite of velocity?
De-velocitized.
And you're a linguist?
We get to make the words. Think that.
They're
Call out the
both,
block,
yeah,
it
you
doesn't
guys
matter.
are both descriptivists.
Other questions or comments? Okay, well, I hope we have some good discussions around the case scenarios. I think there's a lot of interesting things there, and it's not about whether or not there's a right answer to those scenarios. It's more about the process of how we get there. So, see you then. Thanks.
Should mention in connection with that the slide that says risk and probability plus 3 times.